So this lecture is part of the Dr. and Mrs. DeBow Freed Contemporary Christian Lecture Series. And we read in the framing for this lecture series that these lectures are intended to engender reflection, discussion, and values-based action on the part of students, faculty, and staff, as well as the broader community. And we're grateful for those of you who are part of the community who have also decided to come and join us tonight. I'm confident that Reverend Dr. Drew Hart's lecture, Who Will Be a Witness, will do just that. It will engender that kind of discussion, and it will prompt us to values-based action. And we look forward to it. Dr. Hart has graciously agreed, I'll note now, to answer questions following his lecture. So perhaps you might capture some of the questions you might have as he speaks. Go ahead and jot those down, and we'd be happy to hear those questions at the conclusion of his remarks. Reverend Dr. Drew Hart is an author, activist, an associate professor in theology in the Bible and Religion Department at Messiah University with 10 years of pastoral experience. Dr. Hart majored in biblical studies at Messiah College as an undergraduate. He attained his Master's of Divinity with an urban concentration from Biblical Theological Seminary, and he received his PhD in theology and ethics from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Dr. Hart directs Messiah University's Thriving Together Congregations for Racial Justice program, and he co-hosts Inverse podcasts along with Australian peace activist Jared McKenna. His work beyond teaching and writing has included pastoring in Harrisburg and Philadelphia, working for an inner-city after-school program for Black and brown middle school boys, delivering lectures and leading anti-racism workshops, collaborating with faith-based organizations in his neighborhood, and doing a broad range of public theology. Dr. Hart is the author of the book Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism in 2016, and the other book, Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance, which came out in 2020. You might recognize the title of that book. It's the title of his lecture tonight. He's an international speaker and was the recipient of BCM Peace's 2017 Peacemaker Award, the 2019 W.E.B. Du Bois Award in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and was Elizabethtown College's 2019 Peace Fellow. Dr. Hart and his family live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but we are so glad that he has decided to join us tonight here in Findlay. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Drew Hart.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that introduction and for the invitation to come. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the hospitality that I've already experienced and so many wonderful conversations, both with faculty as well as students. It's been a pleasure. As Sean mentioned, I will give a talk on the title, Who Will Be a Witness? I want to tell a story to start off. I've been reflecting quite a bit about my upbringing, and I remember one time when I was in middle school, we were on a field trip, and they took us out, and we were at a mall to eat lunch. And while I was out, they kind of sent us off in groups that we had to stay together. And my group was a bunch of middle school boys, all right? And just you can imagine, they just let loose middle school boys out into the world. And so as we were going, we came upon an escalator. You can see the dilemma here. We got pushed into a corner where we didn't really have a choice upon which we were going to do next, right? We decided that we were going to go up this escalator the wrong way, right? I mean, what else were we going to do? We didn't have a choice. And so we began to go up this escalator the wrong way, and And before you knew it, we're on this escalator, we're moving, and you realize like it actually takes some work to get like from one floor to the next floor. Like it's not just like, a casual, slow walk. Like you've got to actually work to get up to that next floor. And so we were determined that we were going to get to that next floor. So we're going up and we're kind of being determined and striding and making our way, being deliberate. And as we're doing that, people are coming, of course, the opposite direction that we are going in. And so we've got to kind of navigate. Other people go around, the direction that they're flowing. We've got to go. And we realize that we can't really take any breaks, right? Like if you're going up the escalator the wrong way, like if you pause and do time out, right, to take a break, it doesn't really work because just because your body's not moving doesn't mean that you're not being moved in a particular direction. And so we found ourselves having to keep going and keeping our eyes on that second floor, being deliberate to try to get up there. But eventually, of course, we did get up to that escalator, to that second floor. And one of the things that I think that's been helpful for me as I reflect on like these little moments, these random little moments, besides just the silliness that I hope everyone at some point goes up the escalator the wrong way, at least once, right? If you haven't done that, make that a bucket list item that everyone should accomplish if you can. But beyond that, it's just been a helpful analogy for me as I think about the challenges that we have in front of us and the kind of imaginative shift in the kind of work that we need to do moving forward, that actually has been a helpful metaphor for me. To think about the fact that we are in the context of centuries of history. Before we were even born, centuries of history has shaped our realities that we were born into. And so there is inertia already at work in our worlds, shaping and directing and flowing society in a particular direction. And some of that, which I'll talk about in terms of the history of colonial conquest, and so much really heavy stuff that has shaped our society and our world in really significant ways. And as a theologian, I think about the significance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That God in Jesus Christ took on flesh is what we claim. And in that, invited us into God's reign. That is a counter witness to the death-dealing forces of this world. And a participation in liberation and justice and healing and love and all the good things that point to God's shalom, God's flourishing, God's interdependent realities in our society today. And so as I think about going up the escalator the wrong way, I'm reminded of the fact that there's so much work that we must do to be deliberate about striving towards this beloved community, that we sometimes will have folks moving in the opposite direction than we're going in. And sometimes we're going to want to give up and take a break, but we've got to persevere. And so I want us to have an imagination that that the kind of work ahead of us is the kind of work of moving from one floor to another. Like it's not just a tweak or a small little shift, but it's really going in a whole new direction, counter to some of the death-dealing forces that have shaped us. Hopefully, as I talk, that will make a little more sense as we move along. So recently, there has been increasing dialogue about the rise of white Christian nationalism and the way that it directly clashes with the way of Jesus while also working against the development of a just and plural society. And I believe it further turns our nation away from any semblance of a healthy democratic republic. Of course, these things are not new. They are the inevitable byproducts of a long, diseased Christian witness, especially in the West. There has also been a lot more willingness in recent years for more people to explicitly name white supremacy, which many people in mainstream society were hesitant to do, I think, prior to the Black Lives Matter movement and prior to the unashamed and overt racism that came into the public square during the Trump presidency. Nonetheless, I'm not so sure our society really understands how pervasive white supremacy actually is, and in particular, the role the church has had in its development. Ultimately, I'm really concerned about the contemporary witness of the church. On one hand, we're seeing massive disillusionment with many forms of organized religion on unprecedented levels within our nation. And there are legitimate reasons for that kind of response. On the other hand, for those who remain, there is a need to live out a more compelling and just faith that bears witness to the beautiful and radical way of life found in the person of Jesus Christ. So for this talk, I'll briefly remind us of the historical problem of Christendom and the historical and contemporary problem of white supremacy, and I'll end with a special challenge to those who claim to live by the life and teachings of Jesus. So to start off, I want us to think about this idea of white supremacy. And fundamentally for me, I want to contend that Christian supremacy birthed white supremacy into this world. Christian supremacy birthed white supremacy into this world. And I say it in that way to be explicit that I'm not just saying that Christians were complicit with racism, which is a popular talking point, I think, in recent years, to think about the different ways that Christians have been complicit in racism over the last 400 years. What I want to suggest is that Western Christianity birthed white supremacy into the world. So let's think about the history of Christendom and colonialism a little bit. While Christendom technically begins to emerge prior to Constantine's reign and continues to grow for centuries afterwards, Constantine's name has nonetheless become almost synonymous with top-down Christianity and church and state getting in bed with one another. Because in the early 4th century, he began bolstering the church with imperial backing. The bishops gained unprecedented access to the emperor, and the church grew in popularity, moving from the margins to the center. Though I'm sometimes more interested personally in the unfaithfulness of the bishop Eusebius, if you know who that is, who spoke about Constantine like he was God's son more than I'm particularly concerned with Constantine doing exactly what you might expect Roman emperors to do in the 4th century. However, it wasn't until Theodosius that Christianity was made the official religion of the empire, and he officially banned paganism in 380 AD. Western Christendom would continue to grow for centuries and climaxed around the first millennium with a split from the east, followed by centuries of crusades carried out in the name of the Prince of Peace. And what develops from this history is that Western Christianity and Western civilization begin to get conflated with one another as though they are one and the same thing. And so as Western civilization looks out at other nations, they see through a distorted lens of European Christianity versus heathenism. That's kind of the framework that people are seeing. And so it's no wonder then that in 1441, Portugal begins violently stealing and enslaving Africans and theologically justifying the practice of plundering bodies within an explicitly Christian framework. Then in 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued Romanus Pontifex, in which the church formally gave permission for nations to plunder and enslave non-Christian lands and peoples perpetually. In 1492, Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Caribbean islands, and while the era of Western Christianized plunder of other people and lands technically began before him, his violent brutality, genocide, torture, rape, and bloodshed of the indigenous peoples he encountered rightly makes him the symbol and mascot of colonial conquest, just as much, if not more than Constantine is tied to the rise of Western Christendom. If there's such a thing as Constantinian Christianity, as some people like to say, then surely there ought to be its counterpart, Columbusian Christianity, to describe how colonial violence, domination, plunder, and the rise of and practice of white supremacy emerged, all under the banner of the one who took sides with the least, last, and little ones, at least according to my Bible. In 1562, Sir John Hawkins used his ship Jesus of Lubeck better known as the good ship Jesus, as the first transatlantic slave ship from Africa to the Americas. And so that brutal and death-dealing middle passage where millions of Africans died and were thrown into the ocean or survived and were tortured and humiliated in preparation for the New World would be forever tied to the name of Jesus. Many people are now familiar with the date 1619, when Africans are first brought to the British colonies for forced labor, which ties this soon-to-be emerging nation into complicity and participation in a long death-dealing history. And it would be these colonies and the eventual founding of the United States that would perfect white supremacy, anti-blackness, and indigenous erasure in ideology, policy, and custom to justify the plunder of native lands and black bodies, creating unimaginable wealth at the expense of others made in the image of God. Conquest, plunder, perpetual enslavement, stolen resources, and the pursuit of social domination and control over non-white peoples were all justified theologically and biblically by mainstream Western Christianity, and it was carried out by the nations that the church claimed to have Christianized. Most white Christians have never took the time to learn this history, even less have sat with the severity of the harm done and lamented it before God, and even less have sought to consider what healing and repair might look like for the church in a world still diseased by this legacy. Many Christians today have inherited a mangled Christianity that calls us to live a life very different from what is revealed by the person, life, and teachings of Jesus. I would suggest that Jesus has been converted and colonized into a mascot for the status quo. He was a first-century Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation. And it's important to remember, Christianity is not indigenous to the West. The early church was led by African and Asian leaders whom we would deem people of color today. The West does not have a copyright on Jesus, on biblical interpretation, or theological orthodoxy. Jesus has been replaced with a westernized and whitened Jesus that takes sides with the powerful and the rich, upholds the status quo, and is apathetic towards the disproportionate suffering of the most vulnerable among us. The West has forgotten that they are Gentiles who have been adopted into somebody else's story. Thinking Willie Jennings for those who are following along. Instead, many act like it is others who must be adopted into Western civilization and its ongoing story. All this has perpetuated our ongoing struggle today, where white Christian nationalism is growing, and many are willing to coercively impose their vision for society in the name of Jesus onto everyone else. For some, Constantine and Columbus even represent, for some, even faithful social action, even more than I think the actual life and teachings of Jesus do, which are said to be sometimes too unrealistic for actual Christians to follow in this world. I would suggest that the consistent message in the New Testament calls for discipleship to Jesus. It's said in a whole variety of different ways, right? Just come follow after me, come be my disciples, imitate me, follow my footsteps, follow the way of the Lamb, participate in the life of Jesus, conform to the image of the Son. We could go on and on and on. But in various ways throughout the New Testament, the invitation is to become a disciple of Jesus Christ in the way of Jesus. And so there we have this consistent message, and yet mainstream Christians have often found clever and sophisticated ways to opt out of the way of Jesus. I often tell my students that oftentimes one common feature that I've seen common in mainstream American Christianity in particular is what I call the cradle to the cross jump, right? Because everybody loves baby Jesus, right? He's just so warm and fuzzy and gives us good feelings. Everyone loves baby Jesus. And then, the message of the cross is very important, right? Jesus died for you is what people want you to remember. And everything else in between is kind of optional. You can kind of take it or leave it. It's not necessary for Christian faith. I often say we treat the Jesus story like a buffet line, right? If you got the Jesus, you got the baby Jesus, and you got the dying Jesus on the cross, and you can pick and choose the aspects of Jesus' story that you most resonate with. One of my colleagues, Richard Crane, he also teaches theology at Messiah University. He says we treat Jesus like our crazy uncle. He says, he's like, think about when you have a big family gathering, maybe it's Thanksgiving meal, and maybe you have like a friend that you've invited over to the family gathering, and then you've got to kind of warn them about some family dynamics, right? And so you got that one person. Every family's got at least one person that just says kind of wild stuff, right? And so you got to warn them ahead of time, like, oh, that's just Uncle so-and-so, right? Nobody really takes him seriously. Don't worry about it, right? And so he suggested that's how we treat Jesus. That's just Jesus talking. He doesn't really mean, love your enemies, speak truthfully, care for the poor, stand up for the vulnerable, the least, last, and lost. He doesn't really mean those things. We can continue on as we already are. I think that we found clever and sophisticated ways to opt out of the way of Jesus. I often tease my students that even when you hear the language of take up your cross has been domesticated to fit into kind of American lives, comfortable American lives as it is. And so you think, first century state-sanctioned execution, but we found ways to kind of use that language to fit into whatever we already are experiencing. And so, someone is going to the mall and they can't get a close parking spot, it's their cross to bear for Jesus, right? Or they're walking down the sidewalk and they're wearing their Christian t-shirt and someone gives them a funny look and it's their cross to bear for Jesus, right? Or of course, in the middle of the winter and your electric blanket breaks down, right? Burr, and it's your cross to bear for Jesus. And so we found all kinds of ways of applying these theological ideas that were concrete in the first century, explicitly meaning first state-sanctioned execution, and now are applied to everything and anything that we would have already experienced had we not been following Jesus. The gospel accounts, in their specificity, reveal Jesus' commitment and message of justice, peace, and deliverance for the poor and oppressed. And I really believe that the climax of the Jesus story is in his confrontation with the Jerusalem establishment. That's, especially for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's the climax of the story, is as he clashes with the center of political, economic, religious, and cultural life there, those in cahoots with the Roman Empire, and confronts them, and names, out of many things, those who devour widows' homes is one of the things he critiques them for while he's there. And because of that, the empire decides that they want to crush him and stop his movement. And so when we think about this idea of going backwards on an elevator, this metaphor for discipleship to Jesus and the life of pursuing God's reign, God's shalom, having a vision for God's beloved community, it's a reminder not only of the history, this legacy that we've inherited, this world not that we've created, but that we have inherited, but this invitation to be a contrast, a counter-witness, living faithfully, deliberately, and radically in response to the challenges that we face today. But as I mentioned at the front, I believe that many folks do not necessarily understand the pervasiveness of how racism and white supremacy shape our society today. I remember, I often tell this story of how when I was still in Philly, I was an MDiv student still, and a pastor reached out to me. And he was also a seminary student at the same seminary. He reached out and wanted to get together just to chat and get to know each other. And so we met. I was in Philly. He was in the suburbs of Philly. We kind of met kind of part way at a McDonald's out. It was like a summer hot day. And we met at a McDonald's like in the middle of the afternoon. And we got, those sweet teas. You ever get the sweet tea from McDonald's? this big, like massive, like drink, and it's just like so much sugar. Like it's like all sugar. It's the worst thing, and I love them, but it's just terrible. You should not do that. They're so sugary that like you put the straw in the drink, and the straw doesn't even go down. It's just like sticking up, and you start sipping, and you're like dentist knows miles away what you've done. You waking up in a cold sweat, really upset. It's just really bad for you, but I really like sweet tea. So anyway, we're there and we're sharing sweet teas, just having, drinking our sweet teas and having a conversation, getting to know one another, sharing our stories, and learning things that we had in common as well as different in terms of our upbringing and kind of experience. It's just a kind of normal conversation of getting to know someone else. And then partway through the conversation, my friend here, at that time, he would have been a 30-year-old-ish pastor of this kind of growing white suburban kind of missional church out in the suburbs of Philly. And he grabs one of the cups and he puts it in the middle, right in between us. And he says, "Drew, can you see this cup?" He says, "You notice that on one side there's a logo and on the other side there's writing, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup and you can't see what's on my side of the cup." And he goes on and he talks about how, I need your eyes to see what's on your side of the cup and you need my eyes to see what's on my side of the cup. And I was like, oh, we're having like a kind of after school special moments, right? So this is really sweet, I don't know if that translates, after school special, but I think you get the idea. You ever watch like old Family Matters, and it's just little touching moments, right? All right. And so we're having that. So I let him finish, and then I probably seemed very rude in what I said next. I said, "That's all great, but I already know it's on your side of the cup." That's what I said to him. And of course, like, who says that? What kind of dialogue partner are you, Drew, right? But then I went on to explain what I meant, right? And this is what I said. I said, look, like, even in my all-black, like, neighborhood, going to school, I had majority white teachers. And was taught Eurocentric history and literature and art and all of that. And at every stage, I've had majority white teachers. And when I went off to college, I went to this Christian college where I was the only African American on my floor. So I had to navigate an all-white context, all different kinds of music and cultural references that I was not even familiar with. And I had to kind of navigate that. And graduate school and PhD program, having to navigate majority white spaces. And even afterwards, constantly, even like right now, right? Constantly before majority white audiences where I know that people are interpreting and reading my black body, right? And I've got to be aware of my surroundings and how people are receiving me. I've always had to navigate white dominant cultural spaces. That's just been a part of my reality, and I've had to be conscious and aware of what white people think and what white people know and what they privileges and ideas. But I said to him, but the reality is that you do not have to do the same thing that I have to do. You can go your whole entire life and never step foot, I told him, in a black community. He doesn't have to be familiar with black intellectual thought or theology or art or trends and things that are emerging, whatever, conversations. And furthermore, that it would not impact his life if he chose not to do those things. And so what I wanted to kind of get at for him is that as important as it is to have conversations with others, right? That having a conversation over this sweet teacup is not going to bring down the walls of racism, because we're talking about systems and structures that are advantaging some and disadvantaging others, and we've got to see a much more complex problem that shapes our society and how it functions and works in our world. And I think one of the challenges that I found in the church is that many people have very simplistic answers to very complex problems. We see, there's a race problem, and we want to have pulpit swaps and potlucks, and we think that will bring down centuries of oppression and discrimination will all be washed away as we hold hands and sing, "We shall overcome together" or something. And I think that we have unfair expectations of thinking that simplistic answers can answer our complex problems. But when we begin to kind of have a more broader understanding of what racism is and how it shapes our society, I think then we can begin to have a more nuanced understanding of the challenges before us. I often say that racism, there's kind of two primary, I guess you could say there's more than that, but certainly two main ways that people tend to think about racism and what they mean when they use the word. The very probably most common way that people use the language of racism is to describe the ways in which, if someone hates or has bigotry or prejudice from one person towards another person, right? That's what I think most people mean when they talk about racism. But when I think about it, I would say like that's more of a thin definition that is focused on matters of the heart and intent, but doesn't help to understand how our society is structured and what's happening all around us. And I think that a thicker definition for racism actually turns our attention to how our society is set up, how it is organized, what are the policies and practices, the institutions, the way that our literal society is organized in such ways that it advantages some and disadvantages others. And so I'm inviting us to have a thicker understanding of how white supremacy has actually permeated our society. I'll give you another example that I often use to talk about this is I remember way back, if you guys remember, you can go back a little bit with me to when Paula Deen had her moment of being caught having used the N-word, and she wanted plantation wedding and all this kind of stuff came out. It was just really a mess. And one of the things I remember about that time is that everybody, it didn't matter who you were, everybody was like, bad Paula Deen. How, that was so terrible. Bad, bad, bad Paula Deen. It was pretty much like unified. There was like nobody come out like defending Paula Deen like, oh, it's not that bad. No, everybody was like, bad Paula Deen. Shame on you. How terrible, how racist you are. Bad, 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 right? And of course, it was like pretty ugly, the things that came out that she had said, and she did her whole celebrity apology and all that kind of stuff that just didn't quite work. She had like a black guy behind her. It was just strange stuff. But one of the things that stood out to me during that time was I was like, all right, at first like all into it, yeah, bad Paula Deen. And then I was like, wait a minute, how is it that everybody is wagging the finger at Paula Deen? Something just doesn't seem quite right about it. So I had to step back for a moment. I had to think about it. I had to think like, all right, did Paula Deen like create racism? Like, is she the initiator of it? Like, why is it that everybody's kind of wagging their finger at Paula Deen? And so I'm thinking about it. I'm like, no, Paula Deen didn't like create it. She wasn't like a mad scientist in a lab somewhere like pouring racism into our water and something like she's not the originator of this thing. So then why is it that if she's not the originator of it, then why is it that everybody's wagging their finger? How do we understand Paula Deen and what she said, right? So I thought about it. Well, it's actually not hard to understand where Paula Deen got this from. She got it from society. In fact, if you want to understand Paula Deen's ideas, just read a history book, and you can very well clearly understand where these ideas came from, right? She was socialized into these perspectives. And if she was socialized into his perspectives, then it seems quite strange that everybody could be wagging the finger at Paula Deen, when in fact, society is the one that socialized her to internalize these ideas to begin with. And this is not a defense of Paula Deen. This is laying culpability on our society much more broadly, and our own participation and complicity in society, and reflecting and interrogating and doing some self-examination on the role that we play within society. Because the reality is that Paula Deen got in trouble because she expressed what I call old school racism, right? It's the kind of racism from the 1950s and 60s. That's the stuff, she didn't like update her racism card, right? The new software, it's the more sophisticated colorblind language that you can say terrible things but not use explicitly racial language and still get away with it. And so I think one of the challenges for us when we think about Paula Deen is to realize that we're all participants in society, and we're all accountable to the way that we show up and the way that we are either perpetuating, right, these systems of oppression, ways that we are silent or apathetic to them, or ways that we resist and actually pursue justice in deeper and deeper ways. I'll share one more story. So when I was in Harrisburg for the first time, right after I graduated, I was a youth pastor working at an after-school program, as Sean mentioned. And this one particular day, I was running late, and I hopped into my car. It was my first car. I bought my own car, my 92 Mercury Stable, right? So a little hoopty. And I hopped in, that's what we called it back in the day, hoopty. And so I hopped into my little hoopty. It was reliable. And I was driving in Harrisburg. Allison Hill, where I lived, it's a majority black and brown community. It experienced massive white flight. It used to be a predominantly white neighborhood, and then white people fled. And now South Allison Hill in particular is, I think, has some of the deepest poverty between like Philly and Pittsburgh. I mean, it's just quite significant what's happened there. And so formally, in terms of not just the cultural sense, but truly a ghetto in terms of the resources and disinvestment and all that kind of stuff that you understand with histories of white flight. And so I'm driving through Market Street, heading 16th Street, 15th Street, 14th Street, and this is a part of town where you really don't see a lot of white people. Like, the only white people that live in this part of town are the white people who I say either like got left behind, like couldn't get out, and so like very poor whites, or there's the occasional like white person that like, wants to like serve and try to help or something, but it's not a lot. Like, there's not often a lot of white people there. And so I'm driving, and all of a sudden, like, I see this big group of white people like on the side of the street, and I'm thinking like, what in the world is going on? And as I'm driving, and I notice like they've got like yellow t-shirts on, and so like they clearly want to be seen, and like you can't miss them. They're like glowing almost, right? It's like radiating, this big group. And so I'm driving, and I'm noticing this big group, and I'm noticing like this flatbed truck, and they're like handing out groceries. It just looks like they're handing out groceries to random people as they're walking down the street. It didn't seem like it was like to anyone in particular, just like handing out groceries. I would have probably stopped and got groceries myself, because it was almost like Oprah, like, you get a bag, everybody gets a bag. But I was late for a meeting, so I had to keep going. And so at this point, I'm thinking, oh, silly church folk, right? That's my assumption. I don't really know who they are, but silly church folk is my assumption. We don't really think wisely about how to distribute resources. That's what I was imagining. And so I don't really care. I'm laughing, ha ha ha, silly, whatever. But then as I get closer, I see what's on the t-shirt. And it says, Harrisburg Invasion. Then I'm not laughing anymore. Harrisburg Invasion. Don't get me wrong, like, I'm fully aware of such a thing as a white savior complex. I understand that that's a thing, but you're just not like the motto of the event, right? That's not usually what you name the event. And so I was thinking, like, who do you think you are coming into our neighborhood with the literal naming that you're going to invade our neighborhood? Like, we're just poor black and brown folk just waiting around for white people to come in and do their 24-hour drive-by, right? As though somehow that will save us, and then move on and never to be seen again. And I won't lie, like, I can joke about it a little bit now, but like, I was angry when this happened. I was so furious. Like, who do they think they are coming in with Harrisburg Invasion? And so I later found out there was a bunch of, our area is divided by a racial line of the river, the West Shore. In fact, in Harrisburg, they call the West Shore the White Shore, right? Because black people were not allowed, literally, in the West Shore for many years because of all kinds of racist practices, covenants on homes, racists, hostility, all kinds of stuff. And so I found out that there was a bunch of West Shore churches that had collaborated to do this little Harrisburg invasion project, and then they disappeared just as soon as they had done their little ministry. And I thought about it afterward. I was like, Drew, am I like being unfair, right? Like, am I being too harsh in my response around because I mean, like, I'm pretty confident that they had good intentions, right? I don't think they were trying to be mean showing up there. I don't think they had any mean will towards anybody. I think that they wanted to do good and to serve, and they had good intentions. So I'm like, why am I so upset? I mean, it's not 1850. They're not coming in. They're not trying to enslave anybody. It's not 1950. Not setting the Jim Crow system, right? They're literally handing out groceries. So why am I so upset? But then I thought about it. I was like, I'm still upset because even with all those changes, the fact of the matter is that racial hierarchy still remained in place. They still saw themselves as having everything to give and nothing to receive, right? And it was fascinating for me to think of, like, that could have went a whole lot of different ways. They could have came in there and they could have looked for, those who are already doing amazing work in Allison Hill and came under the leadership, and they might have said, hey, we got some groceries or this or that, and they might be like, no, we don't need that, but you could do X, Y, and Z if you're really serious, right? But it would have had to change posture from having everything to give to being not teachers but students, right? Reversing the posture upon which they entered into our space. I think that sometimes we don't recognize the pervasiveness of how white supremacy and racism has shaped not only organizing our society and policies and practices, the way that schools are funded and who has access to resources and health care and quality education, quality and safe housing, access to healthy food, and so forth, right? We go on and on and on about all the different disparities that continue to persist even up to the present day. But even in the very way that we live out our faith has shaped how we interact and how we see others and how we're seen in the world. And I think that it's much more pervasive than we recognize. I want us to think about what it actually might look like, at least some of the work, to gesture us forward in terms of actually going up the escalator the wrong way. In Luke 19, there's a moment where Jesus is looking over Jerusalem and he's lamenting. And he says, if only they had known the things that make for peace, the things that make for shalom, right? Flourishing, thriving, justice, peace, joy, the presence of all those things that we need to flourish. And I think about, what it would look like for us to make for peace. And how the way of Jesus invites us, I believe, to bring social change right now in this world. And I believe that's through doing justice and showing mercy, overcoming evil with good, speaking truthfully, living in solidarity with the oppressed and vulnerable, loving enemies rather than destroying them, and having uncompromising faithfulness to the Creator of everything, who promises to lead us towards shalom. And so as white Christian nationalism grows and the church needs a faithful counter-witness of Christians in society that make the life of Jesus visible in their very bodies for all to see and experience, the very form and character of Christian discipleship must be interrogated for its capacity to disciple people to act faithfully amid our past and our present. We need congregations engaged in grassroots social change in the way of Jesus, in solidarity with diverse peoples with different backgrounds, religions, and perspectives. A social witness that has the vision of shalom as its goal. That is a society where there is interdependent flourishing, where justice, peace, joy, and security are present, whereas my friend John Frankie likes to say, everyone is safe and everyone has enough. It is God's dream for all creation, where thriving and mutuality is not just a possibility, but it is a reality for us all. In 1963, Dr. King went to Birmingham, And many know, how that overall went. But there was one particular moment where Dr. King brought a whole bunch of the leaders together to kind of figure out what they were going to do, because the Birmingham movement wasn't looking so good initially. And in this particular case, they had just got an injunction against them so that they couldn't march again. They were running out of funds. And furthermore, Passover and Good Friday were coming up, right? And a lot of these guys were pastors from other churches away, and so they had other responsibilities. And especially in the black church, Easter's a big deal, right? You can't just not show up. And so there they are. They're in King's hotel room. And you can imagine it's a hotel room. The hotel rooms where there's kind of like a bedroom with its own door, then like a living space, right? That's kind of, there's this big living space where a bunch of them are just squeezed in. And I think even Daddy King showed up, and they're all talking and hashing out what should happen. And everyone, if there were like, I don't know exactly how many people were in the room, but if there were 12 people, there were probably like 13 opinions about what needed to be done, right? And so they're all debating, and some people are saying, look, we just got to keep marching, and we got to go and disobey the injunction, doesn't matter, we'll go to jail. Others are saying, like, we can't just be sending people to jail when we've run out of bail funds, right? Like, that's a problem. What we should do is send King out, because King can raise money like nobody else in the room can. And so let's put everything on pause, send King out, and he can raise more funds so that we can re-jump this Birmingham movement. Others are saying, look, this is all nice and good, but I've got to go be with my church, right? So Easter Sunday is pretty significant. I can't just not show up. I need to be there. And Daddy King is really concerned about his son going to the Birmingham jail, because that's dangerous. I mean, Birmingham was known as Bombingham because of all the bombings of black churches and black church leaders and anybody involved in the movement. And so he was trying to deter him from doing anything dangerous. And the whole time that everyone's kind of offering all these different perspectives, Dr. King is just sitting there quietly. He's not saying anything at all. He's just quietly listening as everyone talked and debated and went back and forth. And after a while, after all the conversation was going on, King suddenly just got up and left the living room and went into his bedroom and closed the door. And it was like, okay, kind of strange, a little awkward. People didn't know what's going on. And you can imagine, you've seen pictures of Dr. King. He's almost always in black tie and black shirt and kind of white shirt and black suit and kind of this kind of classic clean look, right? And so that day, that's what he was wearing, and he goes into the bedroom, he closes the door, and minutes go by, and then suddenly the door opens up, and King comes out, but now King has changed his clothes. He's changed his clothes, and King is now wearing blue jeans and a blue work shirt. Changed his clothes to blue jeans and a blue work shirt. And the moment that people saw him, they knew exactly what that meant, right? The moment that they saw King, they understood that this meant it's time to get to work, right? It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. It's not time for just celebrating the meaning of resurrection, but it's to embody the story on the grounds in grassroots social action. And so that's exactly what he decided that they were going to do. And if you know the famous image, there's a famous picture with King and Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth all together, all three of them in blue jeans and a blue work shirt, and then them getting arrested, and that's where King ultimately goes and is arrested and thrown in jail and writes his letter from the Birmingham jail from there. Well, I want us to wrestle with that action that King did, because I think there's something quite there for us, right? I think that in the same way that King made that decision, I think that today we also need to make a decision about how do we proceed? How are we going to live with this inertia of centuries and centuries of compromising and getting in bed with the state and coercive Christianity and death-dealing forces and policies and practices that have exploited and plundered and destroyed lives. And we have an opportunity to be invited into the way of Jesus. And I think in memory of what King did, I want to invite us to put on our blue jeans, right? What would it look like for us to put on our blue jeans for justice? What would it look like for us to put on our blue jeans for righteousness? What would it look like for us to let righteousness flow like ever-flowing streams, and justice to flow like ever-flowing streams, and righteousness like I'm saying it backwards. Justice to flow like a river, and righteousness like ever-flowing streams. And what would it look like for us to put on our blue jeans for those that are most vulnerable in our communities? Put on our blue jeans because mass incarceration is still a massive problem in our nation, where we have the largest incarceration rates in the entire world. What would it look like for us to put on our blue jeans for our undocumented immigrants, right? Who still don't have security. In fact, right now are being used as political ploys for partisan wars, rather than respecting their human dignity as people who also deserve to flourish and to live safely and securely in their communities. What does it mean to put on our blue jeans for those that are economically insecure, and those that are facing domestic abuse and don't have housing? And we could go on and on and on about all the different needs that exist within our society. And we're invited to join in and participate in the struggle for justice, to participate in the healing of our world, to participate in the restorative work that actually is life-giving rather than death-dealing. And so as I close and we think about how to have a kind of action, this values-based action in the world, that we might actually put on our blue jeans and follow in the way of Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. I hope you're writing down questions. I can only imagine that a talk like this would generate some conversation. So I'd warned you at the beginning that there would warn, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but there is a question and answer period. So I do hope that you're writing down questions. If I'm not mistaken, Josiah is equipped with microphones.
It's a little outline. We'll see how this goes.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah. Well, it works. Fantastic. So it's important to note just a couple things. One, it's question and answer, not lecture and answer. So we would just ask, right, that you actually ask a question, that you keep it brief. And you had just mentioned recognizing human dignity and respecting human dignity. And we would expect nothing less here, right? That as we engage in conversation, as you ask questions, and as we listen to one another, that we'll do just that, that we'll recognize and respect human dignity. So please, if there are any questions, Dr. Hart has graciously agreed to address those.
How can you give us a way to reframe what we see? It's going to sound like a lecture, but I'm not going there. I'm from Memphis. I moved here about a month ago, and Memphis is having a crime wave. I think many of you know that we made the news because a white woman was abducted. She was raped. I don't think that's out yet. She's raped and was killed. The white community is very upset. And so we look at this and we think, oh, that crime, and it's the poverty, and Memphis poverty is color. You know that there's a lot more behind that, right? Why? How do when we see a situation and we make quick assumptions, how do we look at it in such a way that we can stop our thinking and try to reframe that to try to consider other possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I mean, obviously that is just horrific what happened to her, right? And so I think that the first thing that we need to do is to, as human beings, enter into our shared humanity and see the suffering and pain of others. And so there should not be a challenge for anybody to both, on one hand, say what happened to her is horrific and adamantly oppose any kind of behavior that is violent towards, and especially, I mean, a woman running, women should be able to run in peace and not worry about violence when they're out in the public. And also recognize that, you know, some of the violence that we do see in cities is also directly tied to the violence done to those communities, right? And so I think that we can recognize that some of the, I mean, there are certain things that we see in places where there's concentrated poverty, where it's been intentional, oppressive and exploitative, that also creates conditions upon which people do certain types of crime, right? Are maybe more permissible because people are more desperate and willing to do other things. Now, in this particular case, I mean, I would say like that particular case is no different. I mean, that kind of crime happens anywhere and everywhere. That's nothing particular to, inner city crime. But I do think when you think about like gun violence of a certain type connected to drug trafficking, for example, is tied directly to people's hopelessness and need for survival, right? So I think those are the bigger things that we want to look at. I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure there's a lot of justification for why this particular person did what, I mean, I would say that was evil what he did, right? But I think the danger would be I mean, it sounds like you said like white people are upset, right? And so it's the racializing and trying to use that particular thing to kind of reaffirm a racial narrative that has existed, especially in the South, but certainly all throughout the U.S., particularly around, how they act, right? I think those kind of narratives are very dangerous. That's the very way upon which thousands and thousands of black men were lynched throughout the South with those justifications, right? And so we need to be very careful of how we perpetuate racial myths rather than seeing a human being that did something really horrific, and we need to try to find ways to stop that from happening again. Yeah.
Others?
Thank you. Often with social movements, it's a situation of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and people involved in progressive change, I think, are used to that. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on why in these particular times it seems that after moving forward slowly and perhaps deliberately from the 60s until now, we're at a point of 1 step forward and 5 or 10 steps back. And what has caused that radical backward shift?
Yeah. So the only thing I would maybe question is if I don't know if there's been that much deliberateness post the civil rights, right? That's one thing I would question. There certainly has been an increase in racial diversity, and certainly there have been what I call the exceptions to the rule, which is there are more black people in the black middle class than there were previously, but simultaneously, black poverty has persisted. We've done nothing to change the overall construction of our ghettos and our reservations and such that create so much disproportionate suffering. As I mentioned already, mass incarceration increased during that time, right, from the 1970s. 1970, the prison population's around a little over 300,000 and balloons to 2 million, right? That's most of my lifetime of seeing that and the impact of that. And so I'm not sure that we actually have been very deliberate at all. I think that we've been, as a nation, in avoidance of actually taking seriously so much of it. And so it's not until recently that we've actually been having real honest conversations around race. I think prior to that, it was multiculturalism was about the best that you get in the mainstream society for quite a while, but not actually thinking about the legacy of racism and the way that anti-black racism in particular impacts so many folks. So the reason why I think some of that is happening, I think so much is backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as, again, people feeling insecure about the growing, changing demographics of our overall nation, right? I think that those play big factors into it. I think that, well, and let's add also the President Barack Obama's presidency, I think also is a third one, right? I think those three things have deeply shaped anxieties for many white Americans and white Christian Americans in particular. And so if there wasn't a Black Lives Matter movement, if there wasn't changing demographics in which, as they say, the browning of America, and if President Barack Obama had not been elected, I imagine that we wouldn't see some of this overt responses that we're seeing right now. I think maybe some of the good of that is responding to actual change happening. And so maybe that's the glass half full way of looking at it, right? Is the backlash is because changes are coming and people are pushing forward. And I think that people are grappling with, sometimes it's, white kids coming back from college and they're questioning things, right? And it's making people uncomfortable. And I think that those kind of dynamics in which, I see it as the inevitable, but overall good signs that change is happening. And so, yeah, there's some ugly stuff going on and we're going to have to figure out how to move forward as a society. But I do think there's a larger critical mass presently than ever has been in our nation committed to racial justice. And I think that's actually something to be excited about, even with all the huge, massive challenges that we have. And again, that's the fact that it's the largest isn't saying that we've got where we need to be, but it's still better than, I think, where we were 10, 15, 20 years ago, where, again, you couldn't even talk about white supremacy in the public square and be taken seriously. And now I think people are saying, all right, this is an actual thing. Let me try to help understand what's actually going on in our society a bit more.
Putting on the blue jeans. You mentioned about society, racism. If the church was truly acting as Christ's body, how would you see us responding to that?
Yeah, if the church, I think so. In the U.S. context, I just think about what we've seen in the past and what did faithfulness look like, right? So under slavery, it looked like radical abolitionists, right, who dared to dream of another way of organizing our society upon which people were not enslaved and treated like chattel, right? And people gave their lives to that. People, whether it be Underground Railroad, whether it be speaking and resisting and challenging, people organized and people struggled together because they believed that Black people's lives had value, right? I think during the 20th century, it looked like, especially, we all know the civil rights movements, but the freedom struggle in general broadly throughout the 20th century, right? People organizing and resisting and speaking up and writing and donating and boycotting and everything that went along with it. But it was collective struggles. And again, the Black church was actually a central point in that work, right? And so churches have the option and have always had the option to play a central role in their own neighborhoods of fighting for justice. And I think that in today's society, people are at work, right? There are folks already. And so if we're talking about movements, we can talk about the Poor People's Campaign. That's the national movement happening already, reviving Dr. King's vision, right, from multifaceted issues and addressing the deep concerns of those who are most vulnerable across the nation. It looks like sanctuary movements and such, right, where people are standing in solidarity with undocumented neighbors. It looks like people raising bail funds or trying to fight against gerrymandering in their communities. It looks, it's multifaceted. I don't know if there's any one way, but I do think it is grassroots. And it is not, I think the danger is in getting so partisan that we're focused on the partisan platforms of anybody. But what I'm talking about is grounded in the lived experiences of our neighbors, right? And figure out like where are people disproportionately suffering, and how am I going to live in solidarity, and how do we dream together how to move forward? And so I think that when we're committed to that work at that concrete level, at the lived experience level, you know, and see our lives bound up in the lives of others, so that their problems are our problems, I think then, you know, we'll find our way.
Okay, this is your warning. One last question. If you have something you want to ask, now would be the time. You answered it all. You gave us all we needed to hear.
No, we got a question. We got a question.
I just had a question as far as the church and church, ministry in the white church. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. Do you ever get to the point where you're just like, there's nothing like life-changing or really good that's going to come out of the white church? Or do you ever just like give up hope and try and find the change in like society, or like you said, the Poor People's Campaign or something like that? And just, I wonder if you see sometimes the white church is completely ineffective.
Yeah, and so, I mean, one of the things we talked about this afternoon was Robert Jones's work, White Too Long. I don't know if anybody has read his book. But it's just, he oversees, I forget what the PRRI Institute or whatever, but it's just research. And so they did research, and what they found was, this is self-reported, right? Self-reported, the ways that white Christians answered their questions, they found that white Christians were most likely to have racist views. And it wasn't just, it was broadly, it was white Catholics, white mainline, and white evangelicals, that if you were white and Christian, you were more likely to have racist views than anybody else. And to be non-Christian white actually decreased one's likelihood to have racist views. And some of the work he's doing, some of it's historical, thinking about where all this stuff comes from. But basically, the short of it is that the church has actually been, the white church has been perpetuating racism in society and continues to do so. And so I think that these are really important things to wrestle with, right? What do we expect and what can we expect from the white church when historically for centuries, and that's some of the point that I was making, this is a centuries-long story, the white church has not been standing up for justice, speaking up for those who are most vulnerable, has often been apathetic, if not outright targeting those who are most vulnerable within our society. And so I can't say that I have a lot of hope for the white church, right, in and of itself, because what is required is a radical reconfiguration of what it means to do discipleship and to form disciples of Jesus in the life of the church. It must look completely different than it does now. And I'm not seeing great signs that that's going to happen massively and widespread across our nation, right? There just aren't signs for that. So there's not reason to be like highly optimistic that the white church is going to be the center from which justice is going to flow. That said, there are white churches that I am familiar with that have been doing that work or are beginning to transform themselves. And so I don't think it's hopeless, but it's almost like Jesus, his, response about, can the rich, all things are possible, right? But also, it's just as likely that, you can put a camel through the eye of a needle, right? And that's Jesus, so, So not hopeful, but all things are possible with God. But I do think that, the other option is that there are other communities of faith, not perfect, that also have their own failures and problems that they got to work through, but have been have a tradition of struggling for justice for centuries, right? And so there are streams of traditions and congregations that have been doing this work and have been passing that on intergenerationally. And I think that there's a lot for all of us to learn from them. And so, yeah, I think that there's opportunities to get involved in greater work. I think that the Black church, on the prophetic wing of the Black church, I should say, like Reverend Barber is inviting people into the public square, and those are great spaces to get involved, where one can bring their full faith into the public square and do that work, but also be a part of a bigger tradition and movement that's at work in our society. So if we don't see it in our own congregations, there are other places that we can go as well.
Well, let's thank Dr. Hart one more time. You did have a question and weren't able to get it out, or if you're looking for more conversation, you might find it in one of his books. And we have some of his books out in the hall available for purchase. You're welcome to stop by there and pick up a copy. We would encourage you to do that. So shall we leave this place with our work clothes on and go out into our communities? Have a good night, folks.